Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to be talking about a theory called the comprehension hypothesis, which is also known as comprehensible input. First I'm going to talk about the theorist, Dr. Stephen Krashen. Next I'm going to conduct two Spanish lessons, one using comprehensible input and the other one not using comprehensible input. Thirdly, I'm going to explain what comprehensible input is. And lastly, I'm going to explore skill-building hypothesis, which is the opposing view to comprehension hypothesis, and the limitations of grammar instruction. So first, Dr. Stephen Krashen is the Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California. He is a linguist and an educational researcher. He's published more than 350 papers and books, which makes him very well versed in the second language acquisition field. He is most famous for the comprehensible input, and recently he has taken up researching free voluntary reading or sustained silent reading in schools. But today I will be talking solely about the comprehensible input. My first Spanish lesson. What I would like you to do is think about which lesson may have or may be using comprehensible input. It should be fairly obvious, but just keep in mind to think about that. Spanish lesson number 1. Hola clase, hoy vamos a aprender sobre el cuerpo. Primero es la cabeza. La cabeza es la parte más superior del cuerpo. La cabeza tiene los ojos, la nariz, la boca tiene los labios y último tiene los oídos o orejas. Alright, that was the first Spanish lesson. I'm going to be giving the same information in the second lesson, but this one should be easier to understand. Hola clase, hoy vamos a aprender sobre el cuerpo. El cuerpo. Primero es la cabeza. Repitan, la cabeza.
La cabeza.
La cabeza. Bueno. Los ojos.
Los ojos.
Los ojos. Bien. Tiene la nariz.
Nariz.
Nariz. ¿Y la boca?
La boca.
Los labios.
Labas.
Labios.
Las labras.
Y las orejas.
Las orejas.
Orejas.
Oreja.
Bien, muy bien, clase. And that was my second lesson. If you could tell, the first lesson I was not using comprehensible input. I gave you the same information, but if you didn't know any Spanish, you probably didn't understand that first lesson at all. The second lesson, I used hand gestures and pointed to the parts of the body I was talking about. And I also used a word called a cognate, which it was repeat. Repitan, repeat. They sound similar in both languages, in Spanish and English. So now I'm going to talk about the definition of comprehensible input. According to an article published by the University of Illinois, learners acquire grammar and vocabulary by getting and understanding language that is slightly above their competence level. Learners can infer and guess meanings. So maybe you didn't know what ojos were, but I pointed to the ojos and you can understand what that was. When I said la cabeza tiene los ojos, you can remember the head tiene los ojos. So you can probably assume I'm saying the head has eyes. So you kind of inferred the meaning of tiene. Krashen states that learners acquire language passively. Stephen Krashen published an article in the International Journal of Foreign Language Teaching that states that learners acquire language subconsciously. There is not an active component to learning language. Now I'm going to talk about the skill-building hypothesis. This is the opposing view to the comprehension theory. It states that teachers should teach all sound and spelling correspondence in a prescribed pattern. That the letters need to be taught and then a certain other component needs to be taught, so there's a very prescribed version of teaching. Krashen doesn't think that this needs to be the case. He states that it should be, there should be basic phonics taught in the classroom, but it doesn't need to be so prescribed as to, having the teacher go in a fixed pattern and not deviate from that pattern ever. And that's kind of what the skill-building hypothesis states. And Krashen also states that if if a rule needs to be looked up by the teacher, it's not worth it telling the students. I heard this he was in a seminar in the cities, and he said that if a rule needs to be looked up, the kids aren't going to remember it. If a teacher can't remember it in her first language, his or her first language, they're not going to remember it in their second. And some of those grammar rules are more difficult. One example of a grammar rule is when two vowels go walking, the first does the talking. That's just an example of a rule. That's one that could be taught in classrooms because it's not that hard to remember. But some other grammar rules are much more difficult. Krashen states that straightforward phonics should be taught, but the more complex phonics will come naturally. It'll come through reading, through math instruction, through many different channels. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the limitations of grammar instruction. First, learners need to know the rule before they can apply it. They need to know and memorize the rule. Secondly, they need to be focused on form and thinking about correction. So either in their speech or in their writing, they need to consciously be thinking about the rules and the corrections that need to be made. And lastly, they need to have time to apply the rules. But the problem with the grammar teaching is there's only one time when all three conditions are met, and that is on a grammar test. And in my ESL classroom, I don't give grammar tests. I skip the grammar part and just teach reading and those things. So really, in my line of work, grammar tests and grammar teaching is not viable. Krashen also posits that language acquisition does not occur with learning the grammar rules. So in conclusion, the comprehension hypothesis states that a learner can acquire language with input that is slightly above their level of competence. We saw two different Spanish lessons and heard the opposing views to the comprehensible input. And looking at those, I believe that Krashen's theory of comprehensible input is a viable theory. Thank you very much. Now I will show you my audience. Here's the camera woman, my mom, Luann, my grandpa, Norm, my grandma, Phyllis, and my grandma, Adeline. Thank you very much.